Hey everyone, welcome back to Secret Sonics. This is episode 175 with Cameron Lister. I had a great chat with Cameron and we talked about so many things, including musical influences, the ups and downs of his career, selling yourself, believing in yourself, social media, Cameron's philosophy on how you find your artistic voice, why you can't be afraid of failure, synths, bottom-up mixing, not using templates, monitoring, productivity hacks, and cultivating a client base, and everything in between. This was a great chat. I enjoyed chatting with Cameron. I think you'll love this conversation too. Also, I just want to say thank you to everybody for listening. I can't believe we made it to episode 175. That's a pretty big number. Looking forward. Lots of great episodes coming your way, so stick around, and I hope you'll enjoy them. All right, so with all that to say, here's my conversation with Cameron Lister coming up right here on Secret Sonics. Hey everyone, if you're a music studio professional who wants to build deeper relationships with better clients, former guest of the show, Carl Bonner, has created some free educational resources for you. The link is in the show notes below, so go check it out. You're listening to Secret Sonics, a podcast exploring the creative side of music production. Join us weekly for honest conversations with real-world music producers and audio professionals. Hello, and welcome back to Secret Sonics. I'm your host, Ben Wallach. My guest today is Cameron Lister. Cameron is a music producer and mixing engineer based out of Los Angeles, having worked with acts such as Ben Rector, OK Go, The Snuts, The Fratellis, and many, many more. Former guest of the show and fellow podcaster Travis Ferentz put us in touch, and Cameron graciously agreed to join me on the air. So with all that to say, welcome to Secret Sonics, Cameron.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. We've been schmoozing now for a little bit, and we've learned that we've sort of have parallel lives with our kids and age gaps and stuff like that. But It's great to meet you. I'd love to learn a little bit more about your story. We talked about the family stuff. Let's get into the musical stuff. Tell me a bit about your journey in music, how you kind of ended up doing the things you're doing today, and how'd you get there?
Yeah, it's such a weird place to say where did you start, right? Because it's all this stuff is it's all part of one story, right? So so you fall in love with music at some point. You don't even realize that you've fallen in love with it, But basically, I hit those teenage years like all of us did, and music became everything and all important. And I got really into recording concerts that I would go to. So a lot of the bands that I was listening to, not to date myself, but back in the 90s, they would actually allow you to record their music. It was kind of for them, it was sort of early days of the internet. And so it was a good way of marketing the band. So for example, Dave Matthews Band would say, come to our show, you can record it, and then you'd burn CDs, give it to all your friends, and all your friends would start listening to that band,
Amazing. Yeah.
And that's kind of how I got into it. And I eventually ended up at Berklee School of Music. I was going to focus on recording and engineering and production. And after a couple of years there, loved my time there. I moved out to Los Angeles and just started trying to get into studios, and I sent a resume to every studio in town, and I had 2 interviews. One place went terribly and I did not get the job, but the other one said, can you start this afternoon? And I said, all right, yeah, and that was sort of the beginning of my professional career, I guess you would say.
Sounds like a similar kind of trajectory with Travis. I'm assuming you guys went there together.
Yeah, we went to Berklee. That's where we met. Yeah, it's and then at the time we graduated, it was very much just you had 3 options if you were going to pursue recording and production. It really kind of felt like you had to either go to LA, New York, and really Nashville was just coming on the scene in terms of anything outside of country music. It was just people were just starting to get hip to it.
Mm-hmm. The tables have turned because New York is a ghost town now, from what I understand.
Yeah, and I wonder if LA is sort of on a similar trajectory. It's a little different. LA is just so much bigger that I think that kind of plays into it somewhat. But since COVID, there's been a huge exodus, not just of people from Los Angeles, but in particular music industry people and notable people who are doing serious label work on big records. I've kind of made the move of, I'm in LA, but it doesn't matter as much if I mix a record and I'm living in Vermont or wherever, so.
Yeah, you're talking about one person specifically.
Yeah, that's one person.
Right, yeah.
But there's a
Totally.
couple have ended up, somewhere else. So
Yeah. No, I get it. Listen, like the real estate is like, the location, and if you don't need the real estate anymore, then why spend it?
yeah, exactly.
Although I do think that there is something to be said about having been in LA at any point and made like connections probably.
Yeah.
And met enough people to have that career. Like all the people that are leaving LA have careers because they were in LA,
Absolutely. And I should quantify that and say that the people I'm talking about are upper echelon people who like they have a name. Like people are going to come to them no matter where they are, and they're just sort of realizing it matters less that they're in LA these days.
Yeah. Super interesting. So. Yeah. LA, man. Maybe one day I'll come visit, but I don't think I'm going to be living there anytime soon. Well, I'd like to actually learn a little bit before we talk about like your LA journey. Let's hear a little bit about your musical journey. Like what's your, what was your instrument? Like,
as a kid, it was trumpet, actually, funny enough. And it was just sort of luck of the draw. The elementary school that I went to, basically when you got into third grade, they would invite all of the kids and the parents in for a night of like, hey, we want to get your kids in music. And like, they'd put a bunch of instruments on a table and you could come in and look at it and go, hey, little Timmy, which one do you like? Which one do you want to play? And I just happened to see the trumpet. I picked it up. I got it to make a noise. And that was like good enough for me. I was like, yeah, this is the one.
Sick.
So I played that all through college. Like that was my main instrument. I picked up some stuff along the way. I'm a decent enough rhythm guitar player. I'm not the guy you're going to call for a lead part, but I can get you some chords and maybe a lick or two.
Same here, by the way.
Yeah. And then like, some bass and then of course keyboard, like kind of it all you just start picking things up and, so musically that's sort of where it all started, I guess, was like just real young, picking up a random instrument and then adding things as I went along.
Did you get like heavy into jazz at any point?
Oh,
as like a trumpet player?
Absolutely. There was like this... Because like
there's like the Miles period.
Yeah, well, it's like that. It's that kind of thing where you really wanted, like, whatever you're doing as a kid, there's this desire or this need to find something that sort of reflects that in the quote unquote real world, right? So
interesting.
So for me, like, yeah, I got super into jazz and a couple trumpet players in particular. Maynard Ferguson was probably like was the guy that I really latched onto. Crazy range. Everything he played was like super fast. It was like bop, but just turned up to 11.
Like the Coltrane, but for trumpet or something.
Yeah. Like the Coltrane for trumpet, not as like Coltrane's amazing, right?
Yeah.
And Maynard Ferguson's amazing, but it's a different thing. It's like a lot more of the gymnastics of playing the trumpet, I guess is how I would say. It's like how fast and how high can you play? That was sort of like the
vibe.
The vibe. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. So a lot of jazz. And then as I got older, I got into bands, sort of like the alternative scene in the 90s. Like I said, like Dave Matthews Band was a big touchstone, particularly because that was a blend of so much of what I was listening to. It was like, first of all, it was what was on the radio. Second, they were allowing you to record it. And then third, with their music in particular, there was a large element of improvisation. They're not necessarily a jam band, like they're not Fish or whatever.
They're jam band adjacent.
Exactly. Like there's a definitive song structure, but then there's also like an improvised solo that happens over top of it. And so as like a kid playing jazz music, it was like, oh look, I could do some sort of like pop music,
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's what I was listening to, was a lot of that, and then I ended up into more. At the same time, parallel to all of that, I was getting into bands like U2 and Depeche Mode and The Verve. Oasis was, one of the biggest bands in the world at that point. So it was this real sort of hodgepodge of different things that I was listening to and reacting to. And I guess it's all sort of informed like what I am now. I can't like distill it for you in terms of like, well, clearly I've learned from listening to Miles Davis. This is what I do in all my productions. But
yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I mean, listening to records is that's what we have, right? Like we know what records sound like. And so that's kind of what we use on a day-to-day basis of like, we know what all these things should sound like. So that's how you capture it. That's how you mix it,
Yeah.
It's all, your internal discography shapes your taste and shapes how you hear things. So totally. It's all like similar and unique and different. And at the same time for all of us, I'm sure there's tons of overlap that we have, but also bands that I love and you probably don't like, and the inverse. Awesome. So bring me up to date a little bit, about your journey in LA. Like, tell me about, I guess, what are you doing these days, and like, how did you get from like getting your first studio gig to doing what you're doing today?
Okay, so today I work mostly as a mixer and a producer. And as you can see, but your listeners might not be able to, I have a studio sort of built in my house. This used to be my garage, and now it's like a purpose-built room. And this is where I work. And before that, once I moved to LA, like I said, sent my resume to every studio in town, and Sunset Sound said yes. And at the time, they owned another studio called Sound Factory, which is predominantly where I worked. And that was my foot in the door. I was the night shift runner when I first started. So I would come in at 5 and I'd be there till 2. And it was whatever, all the gritty stuff, like cleaning the place and making the coffee and getting the dinner orders and making sure the bathrooms were stocked with toilet paper and all that fun stuff. That was my foot in the door. And I don't really know that it's like this anymore, but that was sort of that was the way that you kind of convince somebody to give you a real shot. Was, here are these really mundane tasks. If you can do all these really well and do them well consistently for probably longer than you want to do them,
Yeah.
then we'll invite you into the room, and my first taste was like some of the guys who were assistant engineers at the studio. When they would start doing their own projects, they'd be like, hey, there's no money for you, but I'll buy you dinner. Can you help me set everything up or patch some stuff while I'm doing a mix? And it was an amazing opportunity to learn how a real studio worked,
Yeah.
And so I did that for maybe 2 years. I guess I was a runner, maybe a year and a half, something like that. And at the time, one of the most consistent clients at Sound Factory was a producer mixer named Tony Hoffer. And I had worked there on the night shift for like 2 years, and he actually had a room at Sunset Sound. And I kind of forgot to mention that though I mostly worked at Sound Factory, you would sort of bounce between both facilities depending on what they needed.
Mm-hmm.
And I found myself at Sunset Sound a lot, and he'd be there in his little mix room mixing things. And we just sort of got friendly. Like, when you walk by somebody enough times, you start chatting and while you're making your coffee and whatever. And so when he decided to move into one of the studios at Sound Factory full time, like it was going to be his lockout 365 days a year. And when he did that, he said, hey, do you want to come be my assistant? Because we just had a good rapport. We just got along really well. And
That's amazing.
As that relationship developed, it's also, we kind of learned that like a lot of the music we were listening to was the same. I mean, frankly, if I'm being totally honest, like some of the records I was listening to that were really formative for me as a kid, he had worked on, was the other thing. So it was,
Wow.
in particular, like the first Kooks record that he did, he'd also done this Beck record called Midnight Vultures. And it like at the time, like I was like maybe like 18, 19, something like that when I heard those records. And it was just like that, those two things opened up a world of music that I hadn't really experienced before.
Wow.
Yeah.
So he's like your mentor, but he's also sort of your hero because he's worked on some of your favorite records.
Yeah.
Like that's amazing.
Yeah. No, it was incredible. It was.
Yeah, I'm looking at his discography and it's pretty amazing. Bell and Sebastian, Silver Sun Pickups.
Yeah, he's
the Kooks.
Incredibly talented. He's incredibly giving. He'll share anything you ask with him, whether it be music industry related or not. I really can't say enough about what a great mentor he is.
That's amazing. So you're still in touch with him?
Yeah, no, we still work together.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah. And so I started being his assistant, and I did that for about 2 years as his assistant. At the time, he had an engineer that he was working with full time. And so I would assist them when they were like producing a record, or when he was producing a record and the engineer was recording it. And then when he was doing mixes, I would be doing all the mix prep and helping with the printing. And this was, Sound Factory, like there was a 40 channel API and lots of outboard gear, and
sure,
like doing these mixes, the process was sort of as streamlined as it could be. But the reality is like when you're dealing with that much outboard gear and you're dealing with having to do recalls for clients, like just getting a mix back in the best case scenario is like a 45-minute process, right?
Wow.
Because you got to make sure everything is set correctly, and then you're like A-Bing, like, okay, does this sound the way it sounded? And
you got to get the tubes all warmed up and everything.
yeah. And then, oh, that piece of gear you're using now isn't working, or it broke, it got fixed, and it doesn't sound the same as it did 2 weeks ago,
Shit.
Yeah, it was good times. But again, like all this stuff is about, all of that was a good
playground or something.
It was a good playground, and it was a great way to learn the importance of sort of like your attention to detail, because not pushing in one button on the console could mean that the bass didn't come back the same. And God forbid you missed that, and then you send it to the client, and they're like, "Yeah, what happened to the mix? Like the bass isn't there anymore." You're like, "Oh no!" Like so. Anyways, it was all good, really good attention to detail. And so I did that for a couple of years, and it was amazing, and I loved it. And I feel like this is something that gets echoed a lot in some of the other like episodes you've done talking to people, is that I reached a point where I had kind of plateaued, where I wasn't going to be able to move forward professionally. And I had not only that, but I had sort of learned everything there was to learn in this particular scenario. It got to the point where every time we would do a record, like I knew how everything was going to be set up, all the microphones, all the gear, like everything was just, it was all set up that basically when the engineer came in, all he'd have to do was basically move some mics around and hit record. And that was great, but I had just sort of, that's really boring after a while, especially if you're not the one doing the recording, if you're the assistant, which I was. So I started looking for other opportunities, and I got connected with a producer who was doing a lot of music for television. And he said that he was going to need somebody full time as his engineer. It was going to be like a lot of vocal recording and tuning and editing and mixing. And I'm like, well, that sounds interesting. I'll go do that. And I did that, and we worked together for about 2 weeks. And then he left town and never came back. So
what?
Yeah, it was.
Just disappeared?
He kind of disappeared. I think maybe he got fired from the gig he was on, or like the TV show didn't get picked up, and yeah, it vanished. And it was a really precarious situation because I thought I just made this like great career move, and then all of a sudden I'm unemployed. And at this point, it's probably 2010, maybe 2011, and which wasn't a great time. Like not a bunch, studios were closing left and right still.
Yeah, that's when I started get my engineering journeys, and there was like nothing happening.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and so nothing was happening, but it also felt like I got knocked back down the tree. It was like, oh man, like this is terrible. So.
What'd you do?
I basically couldn't get it. Well, yeah, I couldn't get any. The reality is I couldn't get anything going. Like I had a really tough time. I think one of the pitfalls for the situation that I had been, that I hadn't really considered at the time was, I was working with one producer and one engineer, and what was happening was I wasn't developing a client base. Right. So it wasn't like I was an assistant at a studio where every other week there was a new producer or engineer coming in. And then, one day the engineer calls in sick, and that's your chance. And you land a gig that way. But I wasn't making those connections anymore. And so after, a couple months basically of not being able to get anything going, I started sending my resume around again, just trying to get anything as an assistant in town. And I got a call back from a studio, and they said, "Hey, we don't need any assistants right now. We just hired somebody," which was frustrating because it was like a couple hours difference. But they said, "But we need a runner. Would you be interested in doing that?" And I said, "Yes." Like I said, "Yeah, please." Like I know my resume looks like I shouldn't be doing this right now, but I need a job. I got rent to pay.
Wow.
My girlfriend and I just got engaged at the time. So it was, it was an intense time. And I went back to running, which was a very, very humbling experience, and just had to kind of start over and refocus myself on doing those mundane tasks and proving to the the people that I was working with that
Wow.
I should be given a shot higher up, Yeah. So
That's crazy.
yeah, that's like the low point.
Yeah. Was there like a lesson that you still carry to this day from that moment of like, I don't know, getting back to the bottom of the ladder just to start over again? Like, I don't know, what are your thoughts on that? Like that experience?
Like I said, incredibly humbling. And then further to that, it also made me focus a little more on what it means to build a career. Because I think there's, especially like with the stories that I'd heard from friends who had moved to Los Angeles and gotten in a studio and worked for producers and, moved up and up and up. There was like a lot of serendipity in all of that. You had to be good at what you did, but also it was, and then you just get picked up by a producer and it all kind of works out. And when I started working with Tony, I kind of felt that way. It was like, oh yeah, this is all working out the way it's supposed to. And I wasn't sort of paying attention to the idea that you need to cultivate a client base and, having a number of people who are going to call you for work so that when one dries up, there's another one sort of in the queue for all of that. So that was the biggest lesson that I got from that. Now, I should also say that counter to all of that, after being at this place for, I want to say it was a year maybe. I don't even know if that was that long. I got a call from Tony again. And he said, hey, I'm moving studios. Come back and work for me.
Amazing.
So I said yes. But I also said yes because, and what I learned very quickly was that there were going to be some additional duties that there was going to be some more stuff. So it was a new studio, first of all. I was going to have to learn that, and we're going to be setting it up and new mics, new gear, whole new everything. He was transitioning from mixing on a console to mixing in the box. And so there was that. And then I was also going to be engineering for him now. So that was like, oh, yeah, absolutely. I am tired of making coffee. I will go engineer the record that you're producing.
Wait, how long was this, the interim?
Maybe a year,
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, legit.
Yeah.
You felt it.
Yeah, no, I and I should say it was a year at that other place, plus a couple months just looking for work. It was, I feel like I paid the due of not taking the care that I should have taken with my career before that.
Yeah.
So he moved studios and then I started working for him again. But then also simultaneously making sure that I pursued my own projects on the side,
So smart.
reaching out to bands that I liked and trying to say yes to every opportunity where someone's like, hey, somebody I know needs somebody to edit something. I'm like, yeah, I'm there. Like, sure. Okay. It doesn't matter that I've been at the studio all day. I will come and tune your vocals at night, So trying to build.
So it sounds like you entered your like kind of hustle phase, like the grind.
Yeah.
The grind moment.
It was more about focusing where that grind was, because when I first started working for Tony, he was working, the schedule was Monday through Saturday, 10 or 11 a.m. to 10 or 11 at night.
Wow. That's a lot.
That's a lot, And so like physically there wasn't time to sort of add anything to that, And the way that his new sort of work in the studio, the way that he was working was, one, he was trying to work less. He just had a kid. And so like if weekends were off, and then occasionally he'd be trying to get home for dinner and all that kind of stuff. So, but what it did was, as long as the work was done, then I was much less of an employee for him as opposed to I was a contractor for him. So if the work got done, I could leave at 4:00, or I could just say like, hey, I'm not going to be here on Thursday because I've got a gig somewhere else. And that was cool. And he encouraged that. And, I've got nothing but good things to say about that. But it allowed me to refocus on how I was hustling, because it's hard to hear, I'm working 72 hours a week minimum. It's hard to hear to say like, well, you're not hustling. It's like, no, I am. I'm really tired, but yeah. So it was a refocus on terms of what I was pursuing. It's probably the best way to put it. Yeah.
Amazing. And so you're still working with him today, like as like his engineer, but you're also simultaneously pursuing your own projects and stuff like that.
Exactly. And as time goes on, it becomes less and less that I do with him and more what I do for myself, which is just sort of the natural progression of these things.
I dig it.
Yeah.
No hard cutoff, just like a nice, easy, smooth transition.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Yeah, I do. I mean, I have a similar mindset. Like I haven't closed doors on really much of the things I do, and I do a lot of things. But slowly, it's more and more the things that I'm gearing towards, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like I take on, podcast work. I still gig occasionally, like as like a bass player. But slowly, it's more in the direction of like, doing the studio thing. you know?
I mean, what you find is that I think you end up sort of culling the things that are not, as all of your time fills up, like the time is the only thing that is like your real currency, right?
Absolutely.
As your time fills up, you have to start culling things like, well, is this really going to help to where I'm trying to get to? Like, is this just, if this isn't really helping me build towards something, maybe it's time that this kind of falls away, So.
Yeah. Hey everyone, if you've made it this far into the episode, then you're probably a fan of podcasts that help your personal development in the music industry. Former guest of the show and fellow podcaster Travis Ferentz hosts Progressions, a show about finding success in the music business. If you dig Secret Sonics, I have a feeling that you might enjoy his angle too. You can go check it out via the link in the show notes below. So go check it out. All right, back to the episode. So how do bands find you? How do artists find you? I'm assuming it's like mostly word of mouth.
Yeah, it's mostly word of mouth, and it's records I've worked on, and somebody does their homework and looks at the credits, and they find my name, and they reach out on my website or on Instagram or whatever, and we go from there. I will say that, and this is a common thread that I've seen in other episodes of yours, and I'm guilty of this too. I think everybody in the world is guilty of this, in that we're not great salespeople for the most part. Like being a salesperson is a skill that very few people are actually born with. And even the ones who are born with it, you still have to work at it and cultivate it and study what it means to sell yourself, So certainly it's not something that I've done well. It's something that this year I'm going to have a renewed focus on. So there'll be a lot more of...
That's cool.
My plan right now is to do a lot more social media focused stuff in terms of how can I provide value that way, not only just to sort of give back into the world, which I think is something that everybody should do, but also raise my profile a little bit.
Yeah.
The self-marketing part is an important thing that
totally.
we all need to improve on.
I find that just selling myself just gets easier the longer I do it. Not because, I guess also because I'm becoming a better salesman, but mostly because I just have more confidence in what I can do for the people that come to me. It's like, okay, I can definitely solve your problem. I'm here. And then once you have that kind of I know I can do that for you, it's much easier to kind of sell yourself. Because this is your problem. This is what I do. I'll help you.
Yeah. And I think there's an aspect of it of when you're first starting out, there's sometimes I forget sort of where I am and what I've done. I've worked on some and I mean that seriously. I've worked on records that are big records that have been heard by millions of people who your mom probably knows that record, which I always feel is sort of like the barometer for how big something is.
Absolutely. I think I have yet to do something. I've worked with artists that your mom has heard, but I haven't made those records that the mom has heard.
Yeah, but
so that makes sense.
Or it's the if the kids love the record and the mom has heard of that band, I'm like, oh man, that's big time.
Yeah. Then you're
But that's what I mean. I've worked on some of those records, and sometimes I forget that. And when you're first starting out, it's not only do you have to market yourself, but you have to market the idea that you can solve those problems or provide value for what somebody's doing, whether they're looking for a mix or a production or they need you to engineer a drum session, whatever it is. When you're first starting out, there's sort of a kind of fake it till you make it aspect of this. If you're going to get hired to do a drum session, you got to convince somebody that you know how to record a drum kit. But then also, you got to know how to record the drum kit. It has to sound good, or else they're never going to call you again.
Yeah.
And then, so what I'm saying is, I can do that now, and I've done that in some of the biggest studios in the world, on some big records with big artists, and I have to remind myself that I'm not not pretending to be what I am anymore, you know? And I
Right.
think from that, you can derive some confidence in selling yourself to somebody else.
That's cool. So it's kind of like everyone has imposter syndrome. It's like, am I really qualified to do this? And it's like, no, wait a minute. Look, I've done these records.
Like everybody should have like a whiteboard on the wall of like, here's the really cool stuff you've done, you know? And like, just, oh yeah, no, that's me. That's me. Yeah, no, they should call me. They should hire me, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's hard, but it's, especially because, like, I don't know, we were talking about this. I think we said this before that we started actually pressing record. But like, we're the support team, right? Like, we're not like the out in the front. You know what I mean? Like, we're, you know, I love that I'm part of the support team. Like, that's what gives me joy, not being out in, you know, front and center. And so people that are more interested in being the support team don't necessarily want to be out in front and center, which is kind of what you have to do.
Right. But the people who are front and center are getting those reps at being front and center for themselves, you know, like the front man or front woman of whatever band you're working with, like they have the experience selling the band to the crowd, selling the music to the crowd, you know. And if you're the one off stage just kind of making sure that the levels are all set, you don't have that same experience, you know, like you don't have those reps adding up. So that's my recommendation to all the listeners. Get a whiteboard, write down all the cool stuff you've done, and look at it every day and say like, yes, I'm great.
And just have a lot of conversations, right? Do the reps, I guess.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Pitch yourself.
Pitch yourself constantly, you know. Something I've discovered recently with this as well, our mutual friend Travis, I just saw him the other day, and we were talking about this. And there's, in terms of like selling yourself, I find it helps to have someone, like having someone who's going through it the same way you are. You know, they don't even have to be at the same place in their career, but we've all, you know, like you said, imposter syndrome. We've all got it, right? And so just having somebody who can reflect that back at you, because it's very easy to look at Instagram and say like, oh, they are killing it. They are so much better than I am. Even if you're posting the same number of records that you're working on, you know, and they're getting the same amount of Spotify plays. Like, you know, there are people I look at who I think they're just doing so much better than I am. But if you add it up, like, and not that this is important, but if you added up the metrics of how I'm doing in terms of plays or artists I'm working with or whatever metric you want to choose, like you could empirically say like, no, you're actually doing better, you know, but it doesn't feel that way because of the way
they're able to portray themselves on social media.
Exactly. So having somebody that can reflect back those same insecurities, in particular, if you think that they're like doing so much better than you, I've found that really empowering.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of my big takeaways from this show. It's just like when you talk to other people that do what we do, it just like reminds you that you're okay. You know what I mean? Like, oh, we're all struggling with these same issues, and we're all kind of like, you know, in our man/woman cave all the time, totally isolated from the rest of the industry. Like, maybe I'm just total shit at this, you know?
Right.
But it's like, hey, we're all dealing with this exact same thing, and like chatting with other people like gives me so much
and frankly,
encouragement.
Nobody's doing as well as you think they are. That's the reality of it.
Because everybody looks better on Instagram.
Everybody looks better on Instagram. I've got friends who've got like credits that I drool over that I'm thinking like, oh, like if I had that on my resume, that would be the silver bullet. That would open up every door I'm looking to open up right now. And then you have lunch with them and they're like, oh, yeah, like I did that thing and it was actually like kind of low budget and, you know, my name wasn't spelled right in the credits or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, okay. Yeah, a little more perspective helps.
We're all in the same boat. It was funny. I was thinking about this also earlier when you were talking about your credits and stuff. Like Travis told me this when I interviewed him for my podcast, that like, you know, you would think like, you know, he was Grammy nominated for an Imagine Dragons record, I think. And like, or something along those lines. And I know he has an Imagine Dragons record that he worked on. And I was like, oh, did that open up the doors for you? Like, did people come in because of it? He's like, not really. Like, didn't really make any difference. But what made a difference was like the indie records that like people loved, you know, and reached out to me and they knew I was the person behind it, you know? So it's like, even if you think like that really big record is going to open all the doors for you, that's not necessarily true. Like, you just have to work with the right right person at the right time. Like, who knows what it's going to be, but it's not necessarily that big credit that you think it is.
Yeah.
You know?
I find that those big records, they don't necessarily lead to like, oh, you worked on that record, I have to hire you to do this thing. But what they help with is getting the meeting with somebody about something, you know. And then
Interesting.
I would like I agree with that. Like the kind of cooler sort of more artistic indie stuff that you end up doing, like that actually, because that's the kind of stuff that like musicians listen to, you know?
Right.
Like,
Exactly. And the musicians are the ones hiring.
They are.
Unless it's like record label and you're like, I don't know, whatever, Serban. Forget it.
Yeah. I mean, that's a different game that like, frankly, I don't totally understand. Or I mean, I guess I understand it, but it seems like, you know, I sort of talked about this with some friends of mine and the idea of the middle class in music and how it's definitely felt over the past decade that that's shrunk. And and there's probably like macro reasons for that in terms of the economy and like, you know, income inequality and all that kind of stuff. But even just like if you focus it down to the music industry, it's felt like that's shrunk. And I think what's changed is how you get there. You know, I think the internet has created a lot more parity in terms of everybody has access to that now. Like when I started, it was like you had to be in a studio to work with the engineers, learn how to engineer, and then you work with a producer, and that's how you work your way up to the middle class, you know?
The IRL.
Yeah, exactly. And now it's much more about how can you leverage the internet and your social media, and you know, you still have to be good at what you do. That's the other part I don't want people to like forget about is like if you're going to be a mixer, like you better know how to mix, and the only way you get to be a good mixer is you mix a lot. So you know, keep doing it. But yeah, in terms of reaching that next level, it seems like there's one of the ways these days is sort of leveraging the internet.
Yeah, maybe you're right.
So.
Or you become, you know, one of the A-level mixers guys for a while, and then guy or gal, and then who knows? Yeah.
Maybe
they start to send you their clients when they're too busy.
Yeah, yeah. Be their assistant, then they'll hire you to mix it for them. Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I do some mixing for Tony Hoffer. Like if there's something comes in that he doesn't have time for, and maybe the budget isn't quite what it needs to be for his level, like I'll mix something for him. But the reality is in those types of situations, when that record comes out, it's still mixed by Tony Hoffer. You know what I mean? On the credit, because as much as I am the one touching the faders and tweaking the EQ and choosing the compressors and all that kind of stuff, I mix it and it goes to him first, and he'll either approve it and say, yep, this goes to the client, or he might make some tweaks. And, you know, he is sort of like the executive producer of the mix is the way to think about it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
That
makes sense.
Yeah. I mean,
it's like that's a deep insight.
Yeah. And like to be fair, like that's the way it should be. At least I feel like if I was in his position, like these are people who are seeking out they're seeking out his work because of his opinion, his artistic, you know, opinion and the way he hears things. I've worked with him long enough that I can mix something, and in general, the things I'll do will be the things that he would do. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Like I said, we've worked together so long that it's, you know, a mix would come in and I'll listen to the rough and he's listening to the rough and we have a quick conversation about it. I'm like, hey, they're thinking about this song in your catalog of things you've worked on. And he'll say, yes, that's exactly it. Make sure that this instrument is the focus and the overall drum treatment should be XYZ, whatever it is. They should be super dry or super wet and reverbed out. You know, it's whatever it is. But we can have those aesthetic conversations really quickly. But again, it's because he's built a brand that people are seeking out. And I'm just sort of executing the technical side of it.
Right. He's got like a certain sound and you know it inside and out.
Yeah.
And if they hired you to mix it yourself and not him, right, then you'd probably do some things a bit different. I'd imagine.
I like to think, but it's also, I don't know who I am without I mean, that's a heavy statement, right? I don't know who I am, but what I mean by that is I don't know who I am because what I've learned from him informs so much of what I do.
Yeah.
Right.
No, legit.
So if I just took that out, it's like I'm not the same person anymore.
Right.
So-
You've infused so much of his creativity into who you are and how you work and the way you hear things. And
Yeah. Yeah.
workflow.
But you know,
So-
as we're saying, like, you know, maybe over the next year, if I'm just sort of pursuing more and more of my own things, like it'll be, maybe I'll find who that is. I have this theory that, so we all pick up an instrument or get into music basically because we hear something and we fall in love with it, right? Like, who's your favorite band?
Radiohead.
Okay, Radiohead. Okay, so
Sure.
and your guitar player?
A bass player.
Bass player. Okay. So you hear Radiohead and you're like, as a kid, you're like, this is it. This is the best. Nobody's ever done it better. This is it. We can just stop. This is the one. And
Pretty much, yeah.
you fall in love with it and you start learning every Radiohead song because you want to be in Radiohead. You want to be writing songs like that and sounding like that, whether it be the bass part or the guitar part, or you want to sing like Tom York, like whatever it is, right? You fall in love. But I have this theory that it is in our failure to become our heroes that we can get lucky and discover who we are.
That's a cool theory.
You know, because we all, like, I wanted to sing like Bono. I was like, oh, that's it. Like, that's the peak right there. And I can't, and I never will be able to, you know, and I don't sound like him. I don't have, my voice is different. But hopefully, you know, as a lifetime goes by, it will be my failure in being that I might discover what I'm supposed to be.
I love that. That's so cool.
A little philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, as like you know, as someone who has dabbled with singer-songwriting, I haven't done it in a while, but I have written songs and, you know, whatever. There are things that, you know, you internalize from whether it's Tom York or Paul McCartney or like all, you know, the people that I love, right? Like that I love the way they do things, you know?
Yeah.
And some of it you can do closer and some of the things you do further. And then somehow you kind of like, I've developed this like way of playing bass that's very much inspired by Paul McCartney, but also inspired by Motown. And also it's just kind of like also what I can do, you know what I mean? So it has its own kind of vibe and flavor.
Yeah.
But it's not quite that, you know? And
what's funny, if you like,
yeah.
So that's who you are, right? But then if you like extrapolate it back, like all of your heroes were just trying to be somebody else.
Yeah. I mean, Paul McCartney was trying to be James Jamerson, right? Like,
yeah. And it was in his failure that he happened to find Paul McCartney.
He just figured out how to be a little bit more melodic and a little bit less syncopated, you know?
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And we try to emulate that, and then we could only do it to the best that we can, and then we find our own little quirks that people that seem to resonate with us, and we tend to go back towards. And you know, I could never sing like Tom York, but I could still do those kinds of like arpeggiated chords and stuff on a Telecaster, you know?
Yeah.
So there are things that overlap and things that don't, you know?
Yeah. 100%.
Yeah. It's a cool theory. And people, you heard it here, Cameron Lister on the failure to becoming your heroes, becoming yourself.
Yeah. I mean, you can go even further. Like, sorry, but there's
go on, yeah, that's good.
I listen to a lot of like sort of people talking about like business and all that kind of stuff. And what you end up hearing over and over again is that people fail at doing businesses and then eventually they learn all the lessons from that failure and then everything works out, right?
Right.
On the one hand, I'm like a little skeptical because it's like, yeah, you're a guest on this podcast because like everything's worked out. Like the guy who failed 26 times and now works at Burger King, like isn't getting interviewed on this podcast. But it's too much of a repeated story that you can't acknowledge that maybe there's some truth into it, you know, or to it. So yeah, people should seek failure. You know, I mean, it's like we talked about earlier in this, you know, the biggest failure in my career so far in terms of when I worked for a producer and it all fell apart and I had nothing going on, like that's where I've actually learned the most. That's maybe the single most potent moment where I've learned the most, you know, cumulatively, I've learned more by working with great mentors, but it will be your failures will have the most to teach you than your successes. Like I don't really get anything over somebody saying, "Oh man, I loved that record." Like it's nice to hear. Like I feel good and the serotonin triggers, but like I get more hearing about like when somebody says like, "Yeah, this doesn't work in here because of whatever reason." This guitar isn't sitting right because you've just treated it wrong. Like I learn more from that than
the constructive criticism.
Yeah, the constructive criticism.
Yeah, because again, like it's funny. It's like all the people I interview, like audio engineers, music producers, we just like are such lifetime learners. Like we just want to always get better at our craft. Like it doesn't matter how many successes we have. Like we still want to get better. And like there's something about that pursuit of excellence,
Yeah.
that seems to tickle a lot of us. Yeah.
Yeah, getting fired from mix will teach you a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I interviewed Bob Horn, who I'm sure you must know who Bob Horn is. Yeah. Mixes for like Usher, BTS. He said like, yeah, like I'm like, dude, your low end is amazing. Like how did you get that? How did you figure out how to do low end? He's like, well, Manny American got a job I wanted,
right?
And then just like, how the fuck did he get it? Okay, and then everything got, and then he just put so much effort into getting his low end amazing. And so like, yeah, these things can put a fire under your ass to like just become, for me, like one of the pivotal moments in my audio career was I made this record of songs I wrote in 2013 and I got it mastered and I hated the mastering that was done. And I just like bought, Bob Katz's mastering book and just like, it's like, why don't I like this? Why is this not good? The professional's telling me this is better and I don't like it. And what's going on? Like I couldn't handle it.
Yeah.
And it just like sent me down this loop of like, just like learning so much more about audio and understanding all these processes and what dither is,
right.
shit like that. Anyways, but it's like when you get into these like frustrating moments, you just kind of, if you want to do this well, then it just puts a fire under your ass.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I mean, yeah,
That's so cool.
Just never stop learning things and just understand that even in the times that are the hardest to get through, that's when you'll actually learn the most. So,
yeah.
And then you get to be on a podcast 2 years later, 5 years later, whatever it is, and be like, oh yeah, I learned the most there. And I didn't feel bad at all, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. I mean, people, I think we're so afraid of failure because like, our brains are still cavemen. And so we're like, if we fail to hunt this, gazelle, then maybe the lions will, eat us or something. I don't know, this is a terrible example, but we're, failing in business, hopefully we'll be okay.
Yeah. I mean, the thing, I think it's also part of like as people, we worry what other people think, right? And failing at something is fodder for somebody else to say something that's not nice, and you have to hear it and that hurts and all that kind of stuff. And the thing you have to remind yourself is they're not thinking about you. They don't even care. They don't care. They really don't. And then also if you are successful enough that somebody says something that you don't like, or they say like, oh, I never would have done it that way. Who cares? You will be so successful that it doesn't matter, So
yeah, great.
That all works out. I was reading something online and oh my God, I'm blanking on the producer engineer's name now, but they were talking about a song by, that song Jumper by, I think it's Third Eye Blind.
Yeah, of course.
So it's a great song. It's amazing. It sounds incredible. And then right before the last chorus, there's this moment where the band stops. There's this huge bunch of guitar feedback, like it's really just unhinged and crazy. And then everybody hits the one and it's the last chorus and rah, rah, rah. And it was a huge record. It sold millions of copies, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if it won a Grammy, but it should have. Okay.
Yeah.
And I saw somebody in a Q&A being like, hey, so I was listening to that song and I noticed there was like some guitar feedback going into the third chorus. Like, why was that not cut out? Like, why didn't you edit that out? Because it always sounded like a mistake to me. And, someone's always going to say something. So just get over it. Like
It's like,
it's like possibly the best moment of the song, and
Right.
someone on the internet has the nerve to say like, "Well, I would have done it differently." You know?
yeah. Well, like, let's look at your back catalog.
Yeah,
and we can
exactly.
decide.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's so funny. It's a great song. I need to re-listen to hear the feedback. I don't remember, but it's been a while since I've listened to.
You'll hear
song
it and
from
you'll be like, "Yeah, that should 100% be there." And then
yeah, I'm sure.
just
It sounds.
know that somebody was like, "I would have fixed
Somebody
that."
thought.
Yeah.
Well, it's this is another thing that I just keep harping on the podcast is like we there's like a stage where we just overfix and then we realize that overfixing sucks and leads to anemic recordings and mixing, and it's like a big thing I'm thinking about now because I've overdone it a
Yeah.
lot in the past, and I don't think I'm overdoing it anymore, and I'm being very cognizant not to.
It's also hard. It's hard to not only recognize that in yourself of like, things shouldn't be too perfect, but then also convincing an artist that you're working with that like, no, it's cool that you didn't nail this vocal performance here. Like it needs to be needs to have a little edge to it, a little more raw. And sometimes that can be a hard conversation to have, you know?
Yeah. I've definitely worked on records with artists where it's like going too far with the mix notes to the point where it's like you've taken out some of that edge and juice,
Yeah.
and you're like, but like, again, we're service providers, right? You have to like, and I believe in that also of like, maybe there's a way to have those conversations, but at the end of the day, the artist is going to win,
100%.
That's what they want.
100%. Yeah. It's a service industry. So at the end of the day, you give them what they want. But I do find you can, one of the things here's a good production tip, a good secret tip, when you're working with somebody. If let's say you're working on a guitar part, right? And there's something that either is not working or it's cool and you don't want the artist to change it or edit it or something. Either way you want to it needs to go. Pretend you don't know the answer. It's really that simple. And so when it comes to, you can just ask questions of the artist, like, hey, like, the guitar here, like there's this crazy feedback that happens before the third chorus, to go back to it. Am I crazy in thinking that's awesome? Like, what do you guys think? And if you can create an opportunity for the people and this sounds probably a little more Machiavellian than I mean it to be, but you want people to think that everything is their idea, right? Because everybody thinks they have the best ideas. So give them the opportunity.
and we don't.
Yeah, we certainly don't. But give people the opportunity to agree with you in the way that they think it's their idea.
Right.
I find that really helpful with those conversations about like, oh, is my vocal okay in the second verse? As opposed to saying, yeah, it's fine, don't touch it. Just say like, yeah, I didn't notice anything, but let's leave it there. If it still bothers you, like we'll come back to it. And I guarantee you 9 times out of 10 people, if it's one of those moments of grittiness or rawness or brokenness that should be there, if you give somebody time and space to not freak out about it, they'll come around.
Cool. That's a hot tip.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think I've gotten quite to that guru level, but there'll be times where someone will be like, I don't know if I like that. I'm like, I thought it was okay, but maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess similar. I guess I've done similar things, but not quite.
Or take the time to chase the other idea.
Yeah.
Like, just find, if you can say, well, let's try it the way you're thinking about it, and try that and then play both of them back. And then most times people will, like, we all kind of agree how things move us emotionally, right? Like that's why music becomes popular, is it elicits a feeling from a large group of people who all feel the same way about it. It's like every time you go to a concert, in general, most of the people who are in that room have felt the same way you feel about the song that is being played. Like that's why they're there. So you can extrapolate from that, like when you're in the room making a record with somebody, if there's something cool that they're unsure about, because they're the artist, and it's hard to be that vulnerable, right? Give them time to understand that is going to create that feeling in everybody else.
Amazing. Yeah. The universal love of and emotional connection of music. Totally. So yeah, I guess the thing that I kind of mentioned to you before we even started recording was I just noticed a lot of like great synths and like almost like a lot of 80s elements and just like, I don't know, you seem to do the pad thing, chord thing really well in your mixes and your productions. I don't know, tell me about any thoughts you have in that matter, or, you know, I don't know how versed you are in synthesis.
I mean,
but,
not nearly as much as I would like to be. Like there's, I can get around on sort of the average synth, and I've got a couple pieces here that I really like. But, it's not like I've fallen, I'm not into the modular thing. It's just way too, it's a level of complexity that I worry that I just fall into it and I'd have a whole wall covered with stuff and I would spend 5 hours making something that goes beep, boop, beep, boop, boop, beep, boop, boop, as opposed to like some actual music. But in terms of like how I work with synths and making them all fit with in a production, the reality is it's doing a lot of productions that didn't sound good, and dialing in synth sounds that don't sound good and didn't fit in the song, and just putting in the 10,000 hours, as they say, of just refining and refining and refining and working with people who really do know what they're talking about with synths and keyboards and guitars and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, there isn't so much there's not like a secret sauce to it. It's like being good at mixing. You get good at mixing by
doing a lot of mixes.
Mixing a lot. Yeah. So if you want to be good at like working with synths, work with synths a lot and you'll get better and better and better. Hopefully. There's the exception, but yeah. It's like I said, like I work with Tony Hoffer a lot, and he is incredibly knowledgeable about synthesis and has certainly opened up my eyes to a number of different instruments and the ethos behind it. And then also a lot of it just comes from chasing sounds from other records. It's like you can be working on something and someone says, "Oh, but I want it to sound like Top Gun or whatever." And it's like, okay, well then we know like what we're talking about in terms of like the lushness or like the way the guitars need to be treated. You just end up chasing something that somebody's familiar with, or at least elicits a feeling that they're familiar with. It's so funny to me. Like there's this is kind of a tangent, sorry, but there's been this whole,
I live for the tangents,
like over the past like 10 or 15 years, there's been a big aesthetic shift to, we talked about this earlier, but like the 80s kind of vibe, right? Like whatever that is. And like when people say 80s, like they mean like snare drums that go like, and like,
yeah,
and big synthesizers and all that kind of stuff. And it's funny, if you go back and you listen to things from the 80s, it's not really that to a certain extent. Like it's the distillation of that. It's, again, I kind of feel like what's happened in the past 15 years is that everybody who grew up on that music, who really grew up with Depeche Mode or Duran Duran or like whatever it is, they sort of hit their
career peak.
Their career peak, right? And like that's what they're informed, like what their aesthetic is informed by. And then also there is something to be said of like everything comes back around and people start reaching back, like, oh, what was going on in the 80s was very cool. Nobody in the 90s would have said that, but people in the, like, basically once the Killers showed up, people started recognizing that, like, oh yeah, no, that was pretty cool. So I have this theory. Yeah, it's like not a theory, but I think it's like a distillation of what people grew up on. But it's also, it is very different. Like the low end these days on some of these records that people call 80s is massive compared to what you could fit on those records back then.
Yeah. But apparently there was a lot of cocaine going around in the 80s.
Right.
That's why there's so much treble.
That's the rumor. Yeah. Oh, Fleetwood Mac joke right there. Rumors. Anyway.
No, unintended joke.
70s cocaine. Great. I don't know. Anyway.
Oh, yeah.
But.
Oh, yeah. That was like 77 or something.
Yeah.
Love that record.
Oh, it's incredible. But that's the, I mean, with the 80s thing, so all these synths, like it's a distillation of how people are remembering how those synths made them feel. That's my take on it.
Yeah. But now these days we could probably make it bigger, wider.
Exactly. Exactly.
Deeper.
And also like the it doesn't go for everything, but you can also just fit more stuff on quote unquote tape now, right? Like if you think back to the 80s, like people were working on tape machines. And so it was my daughter and I were actually listening to, do you remember that song Maniac from the 80s? It was in Flashdance, like, I'm a maniac.
Yeah,
Right.
totally.
So she's 4, and so she loves dancing to things, and it's got a repetitive lyric, and that's exciting. But it's an insane song. Like, I encourage anybody to go back and listen to it. Like, this will be a good touchstone for people to be like, I remember the 80s. Go back and listen to that song, because it's bonkers how little is actually going on. There's like a drum beat, right? Which doesn't change for the whole song, by the way. There's like all those big like Phil Collins tom fills we think about, like they're not in the song, right? No cymbals, no crashes, no big sweeps, no nothing. There's like a pad and a bass synth and a vocal, and that's pretty much the whole song. And then there's like some background vocals and a guitar solo that comes in. But it's crazy how little is going on. But then when we think about like 80s inspired productions today, they're massive. Yeah. There's so much stuff.
Hundreds of tracks.
Yeah. Or even just like 10 synths all creating one synth sound, like.
Right.
Anyway, so what we remember as the 80s, what we're currently remembering as the 80s and recreating as the 80s is where, like, it's the copy in our head of the 80s. It's not actually what it was.
Right. In 30 years, they'll just think of us as the 20s. So, or maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Who knows? Who knows what will be happening in 30 years?
Yeah, it's like a copy of a copy of a copy. Like, what's going to happen at the next copy?
Yeah. What are the 50s going to be like? like the 50s, 100, like, in the decade that we think of as the 50s.
Right.
Probably not.
Yes, synths of like 50s rockabilly. Like, what would that be?
There you go. That's like a totally random. You could like pop that into one of these new AI algorithms and see what.
Chat GPT, make me a 50s rockabilly song with synthesizers.
It's really nuts. We're living in weird times. I love it. Awesome. Yeah. Let's get into your mixing, I guess your approach to mixing. I'm assuming you're, based on what you were telling me about the analog days, you're like in the box, fully. What does it look like? What do you have templated? What do you keep open? What does it look like?
I mean, templated. This is probably something that I should embrace more. I don't have a template is the reality of it. I have like a couple like track presets that I'll pull in if I need something sort of set up to go, but it's like really like everything that comes in gets a fresh take, which is the worst way to do things. And I don't encourage it for anybody listening because I end up doing a lot of the same things, or not that I'm doing a lot of the same things, but I'm using the same tools over and over again, just in a different way, like all the plugins and compressors and stuff that we talk about, like they're all just hammers and wrenches and you can swing them in different ways, but at the end of the day, it's still a hammer, So anyway, So I'm in Pro Tools, I'm in the box, and I think my approach to mixing is, in terms of what I can tell people that would sort of offer any kind of value, is I don't do, and when I say I don't do something, I need to preface that and say, this is not 100% of the time, because nothing is 100% of the time, right? And the things that I work on are all, I work on like a wide array of music, and so what it holds true for one might not hold true for the next. But anyway, the point of all that is typically, however, when I'm starting to mix, there's nothing on the stereo bus. I know a lot of people mix into compressors they like or EQs or whatever. I just start with nothing. And the reality is I try to get the track sounding as good as it can sound just without any of that, and I've just found that it helps me. Like I have friends who work the opposite of that, where they've got a very elaborate mix stereo bus and they're going through semi mixers and all that kind of stuff. And for me, like, and it works for them. Like they're amazing. Like actually my friend, you've interviewed him, Martin Cook, like he's got a pretty elaborate setup. And I mean, he's one of the best engineers I know. He's incredible. But I can't, I don't know how to work like that. My brain doesn't work that way, because when I turn up the fader, I want the source to get louder, right? But then if there's a compressor happening at the end that I'm not looking at, and then there's like a stereo widener or something, like it's too complicated for me, right? So I don't do any of that stuff to start the mix. Like I'll get the mix to like 90% done, before I start engaging any of that stuff, you know.
Mm.
And just get everything sounding as good as it can, and it's all got to work together. And I try, the more and more I do this, the thing I try to do the most is do less, you know.
Yes,
And
love it.
I think there are times, like I'm still guilty of this, but there are, like, if you've got some element that's working or it's not working, whatever it is, if it's not working, this is probably the better example. But if it's not working, as opposed to like reaching for an EQ or a compressor or some harmonic treatment or something, before you do any of that, do yourself the favor, try turning it up, try turning it down. Because I promise you, more often than you expect, that will solve the issue you're having, you know? And I have the ethos that the less you do, the better things are going to sound. Like if you spend all your time carving the low end out of your guitars, you're going to find that your mix sounds really thin and brittle, you know? So if the guitar feels like it's covering something up, turn the guitar down a bit before you start EQing it, before you start brightening it, before you start whatever you're doing, you know? Try turning it down first. Is that synth not coming through and taking over the track on the bridge section? Turn it up first, because that might solve it, as opposed to compressing it, and then all of a sudden it's occupying too much space, and you can't figure out why it's, you know.
Yeah, this is like such basic.
It's such a basic concept, but it's
right. We're supposed to be balancing engineers, right? Like that's what they called them, you know, in the 60s and in England, right? And we've gone way to engineer and way less balance. You
like
know?
I always find it funny. Like people say, like one of the questions I get a lot. People say like, what do you do in your vocals? How do you treat your vocals? Which vocal are you talking about? I don't know. Like the vocal I got last week was super dark and muddy and uncompressed, and it was a total mess, and I had to brighten everything and compress it and distort it to get it to sound right. But the vocal I was working on a week before that was super bright and overcompressed, and it had all these weird mouth noises on it, and so the treatment for that was totally different. I'm using different compressors. I'm using different like, you know what I mean? So I think that's the biggest sort of the problem that I have with the template thing. And the reality is like you probably just need more templates, right? Like probably have a template for the bright vocal and a template for the dark vocal. but it's like, what do you do? It's like, it depends. It really depends every time. And so it's the same thing with the stereo bus. It's the same thing with the drums. You know, they're definitely tools that I reach for consistently. You know, like typically I like the way that this compressor sounds on drums. So I'll use that. And that's like I really like the Arouser these days, the Empirical Labs one. It's like the distressor plugin they made before they made distressor plugins. And it's cool. And then like I'm typically, you know, I work on alternatives, so there's typically going to be some like parallel compression going on for things. And like so for the drums, there's a Waves plugin called the V Comp, which is kind of their Neve-esque compressor. And like I reach for that a lot. Like that's probably 70% of the time when I'm using. But I can think back to a mix I did 2 months ago where I needed the drums just to be a little wilder than they were. And that thing is kind of smooth. It can be aggressive, but it just wasn't as unhinged as I needed it to be. So I grabbed something else. I grabbed like a TG1 plugin and really turned that track up, and it just made things sound a little wilder and crazy and exciting. So again, I feel like we've gone down a tangent, but the reality is like with mixing, it all kind of depends on what comes in, I guess is the question. I feel like if I was just doing pop records, maybe there'd be a bit more of a template, but in general, I find the approach is more important than the tools I'm using.
Yeah, I really like your approach, and I would say that I'm not doing what you're doing yet, but I'm like in a mindset of like I want to be doing more of that kind of mixing. I spoke with a mixer named Josh Bonanno out of Nashville who was telling me about this. Like basically very very small things, mostly on the individual tracks, not on any sort of buses or whatever, and just like, you know, raising and lowering levels and stuff, like exactly how you're saying it. And I think it's just like back to the basics, you know what I mean? And I've pushed hard into like stereo buses over the past like year or so, and I've been trying to like think more about doing less of that, and like, you know, having the mix have more integrity even before all that stuff, and it's like doing more homework almost, you know what I mean? It's like or not using the stereo bus as like a crutch,
to
almost.
cover up the problems that you haven't fixed.
Yeah.
Is the way I feel about it. Yeah.
Yeah. There are things that are like, I think a little harder to do without that, like, the glue thing.
Yeah, I mean, I should say, like,
but,
I definitely end up with a bunch of stuff on my stereo bus. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not sending mixes out that don't have anything at the end, but it's that part of it comes much later on in the process for me.
Yeah. Listen, like mixing into like a Pultec at the end, you know what I mean? Like that just gives it that extra thing.
No, 100%, 100%, or some tape emulation and probably a little compression. And, there are times where I'll be mixing something that's the thing. Like also like the stereo bus can even be different song to song. It's like, yes, there are plugins that I'll use pretty consistently, but some song might need like a parallel stereo bus, where I've got some really crazy like harmonic treatment going on, and I'll just send a couple elements in parallel to that. Like maybe the snare reverb has to go there so that it really brightens up, and sort of like blooms through the mix as opposed to just like trying to do that through my drum bus,
Just like that's like using stuff like Vitamin or whatever kind of thing.
Yeah. So it's but I try to get the track sounding pretty good without any of that stuff. Because then the other thinking is like, then I'll add that stuff and it'll sound even better,
Yeah, it's true. It's almost like it's like a midway point towards mastering, you know what I mean? Because mastering also brings out a lot of that stuff and hopefully gives you a bit more depth in your mix and stuff. Yeah. Or lack of depth if they overcompress it. But yeah, I love it, man. I think it's a cool approach and something that I'm hoping to be messing with a little bit more in the future. How are you monitoring, by the way? I'm curious.
Most of my monitoring I do on a pair of Pro-X. I think they're called Studio 100s. And then I've got this Macintosh 2105. It's like this old vintage like audiophile power amp. The only reason I have these, and they sound great, I love them, got no complaints, but I have them because that's just like the studios I worked at, that's what they had, right? And the people I worked with, that's what they used. And so it was like, well, like I'm hearing everything recorded and mixed on these, like, so I'll just get these, There are some other things out there these days that like people swear by and they're amazing, and I'm sure they're great, but I don't know if I really want to learn a different pair of speakers.
You put so many reps into these.
So I use those mostly, and then I've got some small speaker options, like some Oratones, like little, terrible sounding mix cubes, and then I do a couple different pairs of headphones. Like there's this pair of Sonys that I use that are super bright and nearly unlistenable, but they're great for letting you know if there's something weird going on in just some of that really like high top end stuff that you have to identify that like your artist is going to hear and go, why is the synth like clipping the whole song? You're like, what are you talking about? Like they're really good at revealing that kind of thing. Or like
what, the 7506s?
Exactly.
Yeah, these
all
guys.
the little mouth noises, like all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, they are really good for that.
I just did that to you, but
that's why they're great tracking headphones.
Yeah,
actually, although they're quite fatiguing. I EQ them. I have like an EQ. My RME has like the fire. What's it called? The Total Mix has like some EQ you could put on your output towards your audio outs, nice. Basically. And so I EQ my headphones, and I take out like the 2.5.
Right, yeah, very pointy. And then I have this pair of little Bose earbuds that I use. I always check things on that because that's how I listen to everything for the most part. Like when I'm not in my studio, if I'm out for a walk, if I'm going for a coffee shop and I'm listening to some music or a podcast, like that's my phone and my headphone. Like that's what I use. And so it's like the AirPods thing, basically. So I just don't have AirPods. I have these Bose things instead. Because they got really nice low end, and I feel like I know where the low end should sit when I hear things on that. A lot of like speaker choices and all that kind of stuff comes down to what do you know, really? Like I'm sure, I don't know what he specifically uses, but I'm sure Chris Ordell. I mean, I would bet he's got some NS10s in the studio, and I bet he can make things sound incredible just using the NS10s because he just knows them so well. That's my guess.
Well, Pro X seems to be great. Like I don't know, a lot of people I know have. A lot of people I've interviewed, use Pro-Ax, and have done so many reps on them, and like they just turn out amazing stuff. Like Travis and the guy Brian Bender, Vance Powell, I know also uses ProX. So you're in good company.
I'm sure at some point I'll have to get something new. I don't think they make these anymore, is the thing. So at some point, but maybe that's 5 or 10 years off. I don't know. My buddy Martin's got this pair of ATCs that just sound incredible. But I worry about that, like getting speakers that sound just so incredible. Like, is everything just gonna? Am I just gonna think everything sounds amazing all the time? Like, are my mixes actually gonna be bad? I don't know. I guess that's what the headphones are for. Yeah,
just have to try and see. Yes, you're always referencing and like, finding a few other places to check it out, make sure everything's kosher, so to speak.
So multiple monitors, and then I've got some like outboard gear. Generally, I don't really use it. I've sort of made the decision this year that I'm going to start incorporating some of that stuff a little bit more. Like maybe find a couple more esoteric effects boxes and all that kind of stuff, and start incorporating that. Just chasing different sounds. I've got this one EQ. It's this Moog graphic EQ, and I got it because another producer I know had it, and it just sounds so good on synth bass and kick drum, and it's awesome. It's like all the frequency points are exactly right. You're like, oh, it sounds amazing. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm gonna start using that in all of my mixes. And then, of course, somebody comes out with a plugin of it, and I'm like, oh, do I really want to patch in the gear now? And the plugin sounds amazing. It sounds just like the gear, and so.
Oh wow!
I don't know. It's tough.
So maybe you'll let it go.
Yeah, I'm not gonna let it go. I'm still gonna use it to record things. Like I track with EQ and compression, all that kind of stuff. So I'm definitely gonna keep it. But is it gonna make it into the mix sessions? Probably not. I do have this oversteer modular channel, which is pretty intense, and there's no plugin for that. And I can't imagine there'll be a plugin for that anytime soon because it's very complicated. It's too complicated, but it sounds great, and it's a lot of fun to play with. And there's tons of knobs and switches and distortion, compression, filters, EQs, mic pre's. I'll probably end up using that more this year. That's the plan.
Amazing. Well, I think now's the perfect time to head over to the sauce segment, so people kind of hear what you're working on. We talked about the nitty gritty, and so now we can kind of hear it. So you sent me a track called Halcyon Days.
Yeah, Halcyon Days. Yeah.
Halcyon Days by Ryan
Harman.
Ryan Harman.
He's going to release, I think it's going to be under a new name called Swamps with an O, SWOMPS. Yes, this is what I've been working on recently.
Sick. So let's have a listen to that for about 90 seconds, and we'll chat about it.
Sounds good.
Yeah, Cameron, sounds awesome. I love the the vocals, like, and also the backing vocals, synth sounds. Yeah, it's like a vibe, man. It's got like that. It's got like that, like mid aughts kind of like indie kind of emotional thing. I don't know if that makes sense. Like not exactly Death Cab, but like, in that
Definitely.
kind of ballpark,
Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
super.
you.
Totally. So tell me a bit about that track. What happened there?
Ryan's a friend who basically reached out at the beginning of COVID, and he, I think like, a lot of people who were artistic and creative, he had a record in the can that he needed mixed. And so he called me and I mixed the record, and we kind of just developed a rapport that way and a friendship that way. And then he decided he's working on something new now. And so he called me in to do it. And that song is basically a couple elements from the demo. And then I pretty much did everything else between drum programming and synth sounds and that whole kind of like solo section after the second chorus, like all of that is, I wrote all that part basically. And then we had a friend of mine, Adam Tressler, come in and play guitar. And yeah, we just built out the track here in the studio. And it was kind of like the first thing that I did once I'd built this room. And so it was like a bit of a learning process of like, oh, is this going to work? And blah, blah, blah. He'd sent me this demo, and it was like a lot smaller sounding than what's there now. It's still a pretty intimate song, but it just felt like it was one of those songs where the whole thing is basically a crescendo, right? Yeah, so we just spent some time programming everything and synth sounds and some drum machines and guitars, and then tons of vocals, as you can hear in the chorus. And it was the kind of thing where I just made him sing a bunch, and then we've got some other. A friend of his came in and did some background vocals just to kind of layer it up and make it sound a little more interesting.
Were there female voices in there also, or
there's not? There's probably some things in that you're hearing in there where I'm doing like a pitch and like a formant tweak. That's something I like. Something I like to do a lot, frankly. Yeah, something there just to make it sound really lush and beautiful.
Awesome. Any specific instrument elements that you want to like maybe touch on, like a technicality or something, if you remember it?
There's that kind of synth solo section is a really good example of happy accidents. And so I wrote the part and did all the chord stuff, and then I wrote the melody, which I'll have a funny note about at the end. But I did the melody, and then I had this little, the synth sound is this guy, which is like this little Korg Volca thing. They're like $100, and it's like this little FM synthesizer, and it just sounds really cool. And it's got like a bunch of presets, and a lot of them are terrible, but they're great because they're cheap and they do a lot. So it's mostly that, and it sounded cool. And there's like a low octave and a high octave going on, and all that kind of stuff. And something happened. I don't remember what I was doing, but I have an MS-20 here as well, another Korg monophonic synth. And basically, I ended up sending the MIDI to it, and it started playing into the session. And it was kind of like, there it is. Like I try to do things as simple as possible, but it definitely felt like there was an element missing to the sound. And once we sort of accidentally blended the MS-20 into it, it was like, oh, there's the whole thing.
Wow. Do you remember what kind of like synth? What did each one kind of sound like on their own, and what did the other one provide?
The Volca is like, it's an FM synthesis, so it's like real glassy and pretty and ethereal and all that kind of stuff. But it's really wide and not so focused in the middle. And it just so happened like the MS-20, like it's a monophonic synth, and there's no effects on it, and there's nothing else. And so it just kind of like sat right in the middle of this whole thing. And it just sort of, it filled in the hole of, okay, now that synth is actually leading the track, as opposed to there's just this like ethereal synth going on during the whole thing.
Right. Almost like the first synth was like the effects.
Exactly. No, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So, and there's a guitar that comes in near the end to kind of like double it up a little bit just for a moment of drama.
Yeah. But the guitar sounded pretty thick. Yeah, it was nice. Good, nice full guitar tone. I love it. Amazing. Yeah, dude. Well, I love what you're working on. You're on the right path. Making things sound great. And
yeah, thanks, man. This was a blast. Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Totally. But before we wrap it up, I do want to ask you like a couple of general questions. I kind of try to ask everybody now that we can like kind of wrap like the technical we had like the philosophical segment. Then we have the technical segment, and now we could put a wrap to that and talk a little bit about like creative energies. Like we all have days where we're super pumped to get into the studio, and then there's days where we're just like totally like burnt out or whatever. Do you have any like tips, things you either do to get in the zone or stay in the zone? Maybe it's like habits like meditation. I have no idea. Like it could be anything, anything like that kind of helps you, live your best life in the studio.
Yeah, I mean, if you want a good motivation for getting to work, have kids, because you'll start valuing your time a lot more.
That is so true.
Here's a good trick. If you're having trouble getting started on something and you're not feeling very inspired, just work for 5 minutes. Tell yourself that I'm just going to work for whatever time it is. I'm going to work for 5 minutes, and then at the 5 minutes, I can take a break. What will end up happening is by 4 minutes, you'll probably forget that you only gave yourself 5 minutes. The ball started to roll, and you'll start heading down the hill, and you'll pick up some momentum. And maybe it'll be an hour before you recognize that, you're only going to work for 5 minutes or whatever. But
yeah, before you know it, you're done.
Yeah.
You're done editing those vocals.
That's my trick. It's really low rent and stupid, but I find it really works for me. So
yeah, I have the inverse a lot of like, I just need to check something really quickly in the studio before I do this other thing I'm supposed to do in the kitchen, or and the next thing you know, like 5 minutes turns,
I started telling my wife, whatever time I think something's going to take me, I just double it now and just say that time, because it usually takes double the time you think it's going to take, and then if it doesn't, you come back early and you're the hero, So
and then brownie and then
exactly.
You got brownie points. So good, and it's so true.
Other than
Amazing.
that, all the kind of basic stuff that people talk about all the time. It's self-care. It's getting enough sleep. It's drinking enough water. It's getting some exercise. It's nourishing the other parts of your life will lead you to be more productive.
Awesome. Yeah. And I totally resonate with like having kids. Nothing like that puts you under a fire under your ass to like get things done in the little time you have, and also try to provide for them.
Yeah.
So I'm definitely feeling that right now. Amazing. Awesome. Yeah. And so I guess I'll just ask you the final question of the show. I ask everybody who comes on, looking back on your journey, was there something that you either did or didn't do on your journey that, you'd want to impart to your earlier self, and therefore maybe people coming up, who are just getting their journey started now, of like, keep at that. That's gonna, Cameron, keep at that. That's the thing that's gonna get you where you want to go. Or Cameron, don't do that. It's holding you back from where you want to go. Like, what would be that one?
I mean, I think we kind of talked about it earlier, but how not focusing on cultivating that client base, that wide client base, was something that I would focus on.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that in kind of make sure you get out and network and hand out your business card, because nobody cares. But just in that, if you want to be, this is something I talk with other people about. But if you want people to know about you as a mixer or an engineer, like, here's what you have to do. You have to mix and engineer. So just always make sure you're doing that, and you're doing more of it with different people, because that will do you the most benefit, is people identifying you as a good XYZ, whatever it is. So spend time cultivating those relationships, the wider base of people that will call you for work, and do it by being good at what you do.
Yeah.
So
totally. And just and know that you do it well when you pitch those phone calls, by looking at the work that you've already done.
Have the whiteboard up there. Oh yeah, I did that. Yeah.
I did do that record. Yeah. You should totally hire me.
Yeah.
I will help you make your record sound good. Amazing. Well, dude, this is Cameron. This has been so fun. I love getting to meet you and hear from you, and I learned a lot. And yeah, this is great. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, man. It's a blast.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Secret Sonics. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. If you've been digging the show, it would be awesome if you could share this episode or your favorite episode with a friend or two, and or leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcatcher of choice. That's it for now. Have a great week. Take care and dig in. See you soon. Bye-bye.